Hi! Hello everyone! So today we are going to do our first live on 2020 and Happy New Year's for everyone.
Good health.
And today we are having a live discussion with Dr. Cher Hill. With Dr. Angel Lin and
Dr. Schön.
Unfortunately, Chima is not available today, so it's gonna be small, cozy for three of us.
Mm-hmm.
But first of all, first part, Dr. Cher Hill will talk about her research for about 20 minutes. And followed by her presentation, we will do a more interactive Q&A sessions. And so in the middle of her presentation, please don't forget to type
in your questions. So Dr. Hill specifically mentions that we can stop her during her presentation. So you can type in your questions to stop her.
So before we move on, Dr. Hill, could you please tell us about your research interests or area of research?
Yes, absolutely. So first of all, I would like to say thank you very much to Dr. Angel Lin for inviting me to be part of this very exciting opportunity, and thank you so much, Bongi, for being here to engage in conversation, and just welcome to everybody that's tuning in Hong Kong, Gong Hei Fat Choi, and as well as in other places. And I know that friends of mine, I think, are watching, and they're starting to pop popcorn and open wine bottles. So hopefully it will be a good exchange.
Give us a like.
So I wanted to just situate myself a little bit for those who don't know me. So I join you from the Burnaby campus at Simon Fraser University. And all of the SFU campuses are located on the unceded territories of the Coast Salish people. And so right now in our area, we have a lot of tensions around land ownership and around who has the authority to make decisions for the land. And so I think I'm always just very mindful of where I'm situated and what enables us to do this work in this place and trying to do this work in a good way.
Yes.
So I am a teacher educator, and I'm an assistant professor of professional practice here in the Faculty of Education. So I have a bit of a unique focus to my work. So my research stems areas of practitioner inquiry, of qualitative research, and lately I've been getting into work around place conscious teaching and learning. So yeah, it's always an exciting adventure. I wanted to identify myself as a monolingual speaker, even though I have studied French for 5 years in high school. I'm primarily an English-speaking person. And I am also the parent of 3 children. And in my efforts to really sort of live life as inquiry and to disrupt boundaries, I tend to engage in inquiry that's related to my practice as an educator, my practice as a mother, and sometimes those will crisscross. And so you'll probably see that here today. Okay, so could we go to...
So we are going to start a presentation. So this is my first time trying doing this, so please be mindful of some of the glitches. Okay, here we go.
Okay, so that is the introduction. So today I'd like to talk to you about some ideas that I've been playing with, some practices that I've been playing with, and thinking about how I might become diffractive as a practitioner. So reflective practice has really been the cornerstone of education for the last 30 years. And I have really witnessed in the work that I do with teachers how empowering and transformative that can be. So if we can go to the next slide, please.
Okay, just hold on a sec. I think
Somehow
there's some issues.
Somehow we're not seeing your slides on the screen.
Okay.
So I guess we are not seeing the screen. Let's try the different things.
Okay. Well, maybe just keep the image on us.
Keep the image on.
Okay.
Right now I have a blank page.
Yeah. Okay.
And maybe
Ah!
show like this.
That's a good way.
Can you see?
Maybe. Do you mind me holding
Oh,
this?
sure.
Okay.
Okay.
Then. Okay.
So we don't need the images too long. So you could just maybe show that, and then we'll
And then put it down.
put it down.
Okay.
Thank you. You were going to get good, strong artists.
Very resourceful.
So yes. So reflective practice has been really a cornerstone of teacher education, but Karen Barad challenges us to think and do differently. She challenges us to think about diffraction rather than reflection as a metaphor for inquiry. And so in physics, so maybe you can show this slide a little bit. You can maybe Google this yourself, images of reflection and diffraction.
Okay, enough.
Enough. Okay. So in physics, reflection and diffraction describe what happens when waves, whether that's sound waves, water waves, light waves, encounter a barrier or an obstacle. So with reflection, as you saw there in the image, the wave goes out and it encounters the boundary and it comes back to where it came from. With diffraction, when a wave hits a barrier or a boundary, it spreads in all sorts of different directions. So when we go back to thinking about reflection as a kind of visual for inquiry into practice, what we're seeing is a kind of mirroring. So you can see in this picture with the mountains reflected in the water that there is a notion of sameness, of a stable sort of sense of reality out there that then is reflected back into the mind of the practitioner. But when we look at diffraction, what we see is these interference patterns that you can see here when the waves are hitting the rocks. So with diffraction as a sort of visual guide for practice, what we are thinking about is how interference might spread practice in different kinds of ways. So what's really helpful to think about when we're thinking about the differences between reflection and diffraction as guiding visuals for practice is to think about the fact that for Barad, diffraction is situated within a relational ontology. So within a relational ontology, both the human and more than human bodies are not considered separate or distinct, but they're continuously assembling and disassembling and coming back together in different ways to produce different sorts of phenomenon, identities, concepts, subjectivities. So in this way, the boundaries between the human and more than human are porous and fluid, and they're constantly reorganizing. So as Bennett would say, the us and the it slip slide into one another. I love that quote. This is based on Barad's idea of intraction, and she distinguishes this from interaction. So interaction is these two distinct bodies that are pre-existing, assumed to be stable, and they are having some kind of relationality. Whereas with intraction, we've got all these forces and flows coming together, and at the moment of contact, they produce something different. And so this was a really hard idea for me to wrap my head around, but what I find helps is to think back again to this notion of the ocean. So the ocean is all sort of one body of water, but as it comes in contact with itself, with waves, with rocks, different kinds of waves are forming and we see different kinds of patterns. So, and I didn't want to suggest that it's a matter of reflection or diffraction. I think it's both. So new materiality theory is about and.
It's not
And
either
so-
or.
Right.
It's both and.
And so just like, there can be diffraction and reflection, reflection and diffraction, there can be diffraction in reflection. So I think it's important not to abandon ship, but think about the different ways that reflection and diffraction serve us as practitioners.
maybe we can try this out.
Do you want to try it again?
Yeah,
Okay.
don't worry.
Okay.
Funky, just
Okay.
go with the flow.
Okay. Let's do this.
So I wanted to share with you, my work is very praxis-oriented. I work at the very kind of intersections of theory and practice. So Jackson and Maizé have this amazing book called Thinking with Theory, but I always think of myself as doing with theory. And there's a lot of exciting scholarship applying diffractive practices to research, but there's less so in terms of applying diffractive practices to teaching and learning. So that's what really interests me. So I come up with these questions about like how we as teachers might participate from within in this interactive unfolding of the world. How might these materials that are a regular part of our teaching environments, which are often backgrounded, be brought to the forefront and think about how they have agential powers and how they come together in agential ways to produce particular outcomes. And I also like to think about, what if we considered pedagogy as a diffractive apparatus, and how might we invite interference in our work to enable something new to happen. So my idea was, I don't have a lot of answers. What I have is questions and I have stories.
And stories.
So I hope that makes it interactive or intraactive for you. And we can just see how we go. I think I've got about 5 stories, so maybe we won't share them all. But we can start with a few and see how we go.
Okay.
Does that sound okay?
Yeah.
Okay. So, I'm a fast talker, I just need to catch up with my notes here. So I wanted to share a story of something happened to me when I was sort of grappling with the post-human and new materiality theories and trying to infuse it into my teaching. And what I was trying to do was to create more, take students outside of classrooms and see what would happen when we were in different relational fields within different learning contexts. So we all went to the beach one day. And so the idea of this beach trip was that we were going to collect found items from the beach, and then we were going to use them as a sort of a bit of a way of creating an interference and create some art projects where we would do weaving. And these found items from the beach would help us in telling the story of our trajectories as teachers. So that was the assignment. So, but what happened when we got to the beach and students were out kind of combing the beach and looking for things that might hold energy for them and be involved in their projects, a group of students came across a wounded bird. So you might remember this story from the paper.
Yeah.
And so all of a sudden this wounded bird started to hold so much energy for the students. So they were calling, wildlife organizations, what could they do for the bird, who could help the bird. And I started to feel like that panicky feel that you have as a teacher when things are going sideways. And, as a reflective practitioner, you sort of think of yourself as standing outside of the situation, and you were going to start enacting some of your repertoires that you could then try to shape the situation. And so for me, this was starting to enact my repertoires of what to do when students are off task or when things are, we need to re-engage people. And I was thinking of all these things I could do. But of course, here I am trying to be diffractive in my teaching practice. So this held so much energy for the people involved and was starting to pull more and more people in. And so I just started to think about going with these, rather than fighting these forces and flows, how can I engage with these forces and flows? And so I came and I joined the group of students. And I sort of served witness to what was going on in this group. And they came to the conclusion that there was nothing that really could be done for the bird, and that they tried then to create shelter for the bird and bring water to the bird. And this was quite a profound experience for the people involved. But what happened is, so as a diffractive practitioner, I'm starting to kind of think about, okay, what's involved in this entanglement? What phenomena is this producing? What is becoming here? Who is becoming here? And I came to the conclusion that really what was becoming was this phenomenon of caring in the face of hopelessness. And indeed, one of the teachers said, this is sometimes what we do as teachers too. We have a situation that's beyond our control. We can't do anything to change it, but we can keep enacting care. So I found that to be very profound, and it was through this diffractive way that it came back full circle to the work that I had intended. But of course, this was now more ontological. It was about being and becoming, as opposed to just purely epistemological, creating representations and knowledge. So that's one of the stories that I'd like to share, and I just, would like to ask you all, what would it look like if you really followed those forces and flows in your classroom and allowed something different to happen? And you have some interesting work, Angel, where you write about teachers and how students are bringing in other languages into the learning, and how those teachers can follow those kinds of leads and work collaboratively to deepen and expand that kind of assemblage and for new things and new meaning to unfold.
I agree with you. I obviously go with the flow. I understand teachers are under pressure. You have a syllabus, you have a scheme of work, you have to cover A, B, C, D, E, page 10 to page 20. You feel accountable to so many people, but at the end of the day, if the students are not with you, you are covering the pages, but that you are not actually having any chemistry, any dialogue, any real understanding with the students.
And I think that's the interacting from within part, because, and this is something that I find very freeing when I think of diffractive practice, because so many times I do work with teachers who, no matter what they do, what they try, they're not able to shape the environment the way that they would like to. And so, thinking diffractively and understanding how agency is embedded within these assemblages, not with individuals, I think makes a lot of sense, and thinking about why it relieves yourself of that huge responsibility to make things go in a particular way, right? And so it's like just this tweaking from within. How can I shift things? How can I weave the curriculum back in? How can I keep coming back to some of these things that that also need to be becoming and happening in our classroom?
That actually when I was reading your article, it really reminds me of how you are challenging the concept of neoliberal subjectivity.
Yes.
And then also and then also I forgot something I was sharing, but I was thinking of sharing.
Because neoliberalism is about instrumentality, meaning I'm giving you skills, I'm giving you techniques, I'm giving you knowledge A, B, C, D, E, so that you can pass exam A, B, C, D, E, get your certificates, and then get your jobs. Education becoming training, becoming everything is instrumental.
Right.
But you just mentioned the care in face of hopelessness, so which really touches me a lot.
Also, its agency isn't just a autonomous, independent, that is, no matter what kind of circumstances there are, it's always operating, but you're really challenging that notion from what I read, and was very inspiring.
Thank you. So the next story that I wanted to share was the story I call the story of Mad, I'm Mad. And so what I think this story teaches me is about the importance of inviting interference into my practice, and about...
Can we share that?
Yeah, I really want to share
the story of Mad, I'm Mad.
The chicken soup picture is one of my all-time favorite pictures of my son Alex.
puppy face.
So these are pictures from about 4 years ago of my son Alex. And Alex is a redhead, and he has that personality that's often associated with redheads. He's very fiery. There's a lot of emotion and intensity that surrounds him, both in really positive emotions and really negative emotions. And for a period of a couple years, we were experiencing these very extreme, what would commonly be called temper tantrums. And so I'm sure that all parents can relate to that in some way or another. And so I decided to engage in an inquiry into my practice as a parent to try to work through some of these issues and have a more harmonious home life. So, at first I had this vision that I was going to really get these temper tantrums under control, and I was going to, reduce them or eliminate them altogether. And I started working with self-regulation theory. I was trying to help Alex to better regulate his emotions. But again, that's caught up in that humanistic notion that we are these sort of distinct entities that have agency and responsibility.
Control ourselves.
Yes, control ourselves.
And you can do it.
And it doesn't take into account, the entire assemblage that's producing this particular emotion. And so when these attempts really to try to really limit, restrain, control Alex's temper tantrums failed, I began working in a much more collaborative way with Alex and really inviting new things into our understanding of what this was about. And so I remember very distinctly that at some point I asked Alex, what do you call it when you get so upset like this? What do you call it? And he whispered, mad, I'm mad. And at that instant, a new world was created that Alex and I could enter into. So once he had named it, the tantrum was really reconfigured as a doing of emotions that existed between us, rather than this individual act of defiance, a lack of regulation, or a childish display. And so we began to understand our emotions as dynamic and relational and co-emerging between our bodies. And collaboratively, we were able to develop material practices that allowed us to move through mad, I'm mad. So I was revisiting this story when I was thinking about translanguaging and thinking about where might the connections be here. And so I don't think that you would necessarily consider this translanguaging, but I came up with this new concept of transworlding. And so I think this can happen both in
transworlding.
So both in bilingual contexts and in monolingual contexts, that by introducing new concepts and ways of thinking about things, we open up new worlds.
Definitely.
So that was my second story. How are we doing for time?
We are 6:23, so I think we're good.
Yeah. Go on, we like your stories.
Don't we?
So sorry, I'm okay to continue with a few more
There's a
stories?
question from
Okay.
Jennifer. Do you think your second story is extendable to classroom teaching, like how teachers face math students?
I think there's a lot that I can carry over into classroom teaching. And so what the primary learning for me was about this was coming to a place of journeying with Alex. And so, the mad I'm mad continued. But we came to a place where we could work it through together. And so I think that's what for me would carry on into a classroom practice, thinking about, rather than trying to change, control students, restrict students, how can we journey with them in a way that that really strengthens that relational field between us, because that was the thing that came out of this work. It wasn't necessarily that the tantrums were reduced, but that Alex and I had a much stronger relationship and a sense of trust and a sense of resonance with each other's bodies and how we work together.
I can see that what you did is trying to take the burden out from him, because otherwise you need to control yourself. See, you are not controlling yourself, but you're taking out the burden, and then you are shouldering the burden together with him. Because it's emotions. It's not just in you, but it's in me. In this, we are co-creating this emotional thing together. So let's shoulder the responsibility together.
Yes. Thank you for that.
And then also with the teachers too, that the teachers often feel the responsibility. Oh, I need to fix that kid.
Yes.
But rather than if we shape our thinking differently, it's the us and the person and then the environment that are all co-interacting and interacting. So therefore, it's not just one or the other, the binary, but the multiple, I guess.
Right. Thank you. So the next story that I wanted to share with you, I just have these kind of guiding images. I don't know if people can see them.
Yay!
But sorry, that one went one ahead.
Oh, sorry.
Okay. There we go. Oh, it's very
Magic pencil.
If you imagine a purple pencil with a big fluffy thing attached to it. This is an exciting story, and this is a story that for me really emphasizes the importance of what Bennett calls thing power. So I find as educators, we're hyper-focused on individual students, and we're not often attending to all the richness of the materiality that congeals together to produce particular assemblages and particular phenomenon. And so this story comes from a colleague of mine, Nelia Evans, and she in her work really focused on what she calls zooming out, to see how human and more than human bodies are coming together, and how thing power could help her in her work as a teacher. So Nelia tells this story of a child that she works with who usually had trouble sitting still, focusing, and completing tasks, and it was particularly in relation to writing. So as an experienced teacher and a reflective practitioner, she used all these kinds of strategies and repertoires that she had developed over the years to try to support the student in developing a writing practice. So she used modeling, she used scaffolding, she got headphones for the child to wear, and she experimented with the student standing up and moving while writing, movement breaks, meditation, you name it, she tried it, with no success. So what was really interesting was for this student, despite the fact that she was sort of labeled as this reluctant writer, she loved pencils. And she carried pencils with her everywhere, and this purple pencil that was in the picture, she had bedazzled it with all this fluffy fur and made it special. And Nelia describes her as, she would take her pencils to assemblies, and she would often have them confiscated because they were considered a distraction. So Nelia worked to explore the agential potentialities inherent within this child pencil teacher assemblage within her classroom. And so this is reading now from Nelia's work. She says, I looked for the power of the more than human element, in this case the pencil, and what role it might have amidst our connections. Through breathing life and magic into the pencil by chanting together over the pencil, do your best work, pencil, do your best work. Her writing shot off like a line of flight. For the first time all year, this student was excited and motivated to write.
Aww.
And this is a practice that Nelia continued with all of her students. She gave them all brand new pencils, and they all participated in this chanting of the magic pencil. And I just think it's such a lovely example of what Bennett talks about as thing power. She describes it as the strange ability of the ordinary man-made items to exceed their status as objects and manifest traces of independence or aliveness.
It's a great story. I want to say that when I was in Taiwan, I found a whole shop full of different kinds of pencils. And my friends in Taiwan told me that it's a big thing for students to buy their favorite pencils or pens and stationery. It's just a big thing for them.
So yeah, so I agree.
Okay. So feel free to send in your questions as things are coming to you, and I'm really curious about in language classrooms what you think might hold that potentia, that sort of thing power that Bennett talks about.
Yeah, I think it's a cultural thing. Like I mentioned, Taiwanese students. I think a lot of East Asian students, they really love stationaries, and a teacher might give them a little stamp of a cute cartoon figure, and they might find, ooh, lovely. So, of course, different cultures will have different kinds of feelings and understandings.
And when I was reading some of your work, I was thinking about the language of instruction, the LOI. That was a new acronym for me, and thinking about how much force that has for teachers, right, for language teachers.
Yeah, all these years we have been trying to help teachers to break through that straitjacket of the monolingual policy of one language, one classroom, especially in a lot of Asian societies. We need to break through this straitjacket.
So I think it might be interesting to think about what would create interference that would allow something different to happen with that energy that this language of instruction holds for language teachers.
To me, this object can have a lot of emotional support for the student. So languages also, so whether it's symbolic objects or material objects, they can offer a lot of emotional affordance to students.
Right. So rather than restricting what students are allowed to bring to school, we might want to be encouraging them to, if there's something special that helps you in your work.
Yeah, whether it's symbolic objects like your languages or material objects. Sometimes a very nice notebook. I mean, these things can create a lot of emotional affordance. Let's see if we have questions. Phoebe has a question. Thank you for the magic pencil story, Phoebe from Hong Kong. I read this story from your published book chapter. It's really inspiring. Connection is important. Human, non-human, touches, materiality, entanglements. Okay, so that's her feedback.
Thank you, Phoebe, and thank you for searching out different chapters to read as well that our research group has published.
Right. So, I really enjoy reading your chapters, especially the second one, the nature, how you develop this respect for nature. Maybe this place-based teaching and learning. Maybe you can tell us a bit more. Because in STEM education and science education, increasingly, it is the mainstream idea that we need to focus on place-based science knowledge, place-based context, learning and teaching.
Would you like me to share another story that involves that? Okay. So maybe we could see this picture, just because it shows various aspects of the complex learning environment in which I was working. So, where to start here? So I got excited about thinking about what it would look like if we viewed pedagogy as a diffractive apparatus. So Barad defines the diffractive apparatus as an open-ended, material discursive practices that configure the world in particular ways and produce particular knowledges. So what was, if that was the goal that we had for our classrooms? And I think this is where my experiences in place-conscious learning and nature-based practices have really pushed my pedagogy in important and meaningful ways. So you may recall the famous experiment of Niels Bohr, the double slit experiment. And so basically in this experiment, the particles, as they moved through this diffractive apparatus, either behaved like waves or particles, depending on what properties were being observed. And so this is, Barad's, what Barad talks about these ontoepistemologies, right? So what we come to know is entangled within this kind of becoming within a diffractive apparatus. So I wanted to share with you my experiences in working in this place-conscious master's program. These were all practicing teachers who were looking to enhance their practice this way. That really gives me a lot of insight for thinking of pedagogy as being a diffractive apparatus, and thinking about how we could understand teachers as being a collective, an assemblage that involve both human and more than human bodies. So, this particular experience that I wanted to share with you occurred in a place called the Katzie Slough. And Katzie First Nation is one of our local First Nations groups. And our group of teachers was working to do some creek restoration in this particular area because it's very meaningful for the Katzie people. And so it's very unfortunate that this slough is full of garbage. It's got stale, stagnant water. It's overrun by invasive species, and it's just really, really not in good shape. So I was thinking about how our work at the slough evolved in these different ways that produced these different phenomenon. And so when we first arrived at the slough, one of our instructors gathered us together, and he commenced the class in ways that were very consistent with local Indigenous protocols. So he spoke in Hunkaminam, which is the language of that place, and he started with drumming and singing. And we had been learning as a cohort from Elder Lakaitan Anton to start all of our meetings in a good way with drumming. And what we've been learning about drumming over the course of the program is that drumming helps us to connect with the land. So Vicki Kelly talks about the drum as a way of resonating with land and place. And Sean Wilson will say that drumming closes the spaces in between us. And so in this way, drumming can be a really spiritual act in which one joins sort of these forces and flows with something greater than ourselves. And so it's this kind of way of starting a class that we start in a good way and in a connected sense of self. And what was so interesting to me, because Clayton Maitland, one of the instructors, is a Hunkaminam speaker, and he teaches us a bit of Hunkaminam language. So Namastat is a word that means one heart, one mind. And I don't know that we have a word like that in English. Shwali is another word that invites me into a new world, and it means, it translates to spirit, but it means the energy that connects us all. So I think in this part of the class, you know, we were really being, within these material practices, the humans were configured sort of as one with the natural environment. And you know, if you think about it, we're predominantly water, the slough's predominantly water. The water from the slough will evaporate and come as rain into our water reservoir, and we will drink that water. So we literally are the slough. So that was a certain way that we were all configured within this space.
All connected.
All connected. So, but later, we reviewed historical documents about the Katzie Slough and what this area was like pre-contact, before European settlers came to the area. What we learned was the slough was really a vibrant ecosystem, and it was a waterway that enabled transportation for the Katzie people between their winter and summer villages. But with the dams and the diking in the area, the slough has become impassable by canoe. And actually the water started to flow in the reverse direction. So within this apparatus, most members of the class are really implicated in this history as European settlers. You know, many of our families would have benefited from the diking and the dams and the roadways that were put in place that impacted the Katzie Slough. And it was interesting to me in preparing for this talk that I realized that my own family benefited greatly from the draining of an entire lake to create farmland in the Sumas area. And so in these assemblages, I am implicated. And the Hunkaminam word for white people is wanitam. Wanitam. And it means always hungry. Always hungry.
Grabbing resources, farming.
So within this material configuration, many members of our class are configured as distinct and separate from the land and colonizers of people and places.
And resources and water.
And resources, right.
And farmland and everything.
Yeah.
Hungry.
So the third part of our experience was we had a tour from our environmentalist, Megan Rooney. And so with Megan, we were able to, really experience the slough through all our senses. We smelled the sludge from the stale, stagnant waterway resulting from the damming and diking. We observed the garbage that had dumped there by people or blown there by the wind. We observed this really invasive, it's called parrot feather. You can see it here. It's an invasive species. And Megan taught us that it's a common plant in aquariums, and people dump their aquariums in. And then it just spreads, and it strangles everything, and really reduces the chances for the native plants to grow. And the other thing that it does, it makes it impassable by canoe. The parrot feather, when they tried to do a canoe trip, this environmental group, Watershed Watch, through the Katesee Slough, they couldn't because the parrot feather was so invasive that the paddles got stuck. So even if it wasn't for the damming and the diking, you couldn't canoe through this area. So we began our work that day, which was to remove the garbage and debris from the slough. So within this material entanglement, the class was reconfigured, again as separate and distinct from the slough, but agential in our ability to reverse some of the damage as citizen environmentalists. So what I'm really interested in is once we get out of the classroom into these complex learning environments, how we can think of our pedagogies as being, diverse and fluid, are producing these diverse and fluid onto epistemological realities and identities for us as learners.
It's really real life. I've got this question from Suzanne's mic some minutes ago.
Oh,
hi
Suzanne!
This is what she says. Can you say more about how a diffractive pedagogy can decenter the focus on the individual teacher and the individual student? I see this as vital, but what would need to change in teacher education, for example?
That's a great question and a really, really big question. The first thing that comes to my mind is assessment practices really need to change, right? Because they're so focused on an epistemological stance rather than an ontological stance. And so I think if we are decentering the human, and we're looking more at what is becoming through our work, particularly with work like where students come and work to do creek restoration. Like in this example, we see something that is becoming that exceeds the human boundaries. So how are these bodies that are interacting, becoming in ways that change, that have multiple ways of changing. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I just feel it's life transforming experiences because you are not in a classroom learning packets of knowledge or skills, but you are actually going into the world and transforming yourself and the reality together.
But it's a similar question that arose from our group, from Pedro. He mentioned that our educational system is very conservative, and the assessment is taken into consideration as an individual accomplishment rather than a collective.
You get an individual grade.
And then learning is a standardized process that has very little space for differences, and how did you suggest for diffractive practitioner to consider when thinking of assessment or designing their assessment material?
This is another really, really big question. I think we really need to come up with some new models.
Yeah, and we just need to have more allies. And we need to do advocacy work. And we need to change something.
And I'm wondering, like, if people could value, it's that, like, zooming out. Like, how do we get parents to zoom out as well and understand how these assemblages are shifting and things are happening for beyond the student. What is happening for the class? What is happening for school? What is happening for the place, the community, the neighborhood? What is happening in the environment in which students are learning?
I think we really need a paradigm change. I think parents or teachers, coming from East Asian context, exam culture, certificate, credential culture, but we know that the world is changing so fast, and those who can really have impactful work in this world are not those who have those degrees or high marks or high grades, but who can really get into this complex network of people and reality and communities and have some impactful experience.
And thinking about what's happening when we're prioritizing the human experience, right? And so thinking about being always hungry and how we can't sustain that.
No, we cannot. And also always greedy and wanting more and more and more, and we just need to rethink everything. I think for education.
So I'm just kind of curious, and then it's coming from Phoebe as well, where we talked about the curriculum cycle, where curriculum planning and then teaching and assessments becomes a cycle, and it's somewhat linear.
Right.
And you mentioned about the paradigm shift, and how would you envision this curriculum cycle in this regard?
That's another great question. What I've turned to in my own practice is more of curricular maps. So when I taught a course before, I had a sense of, where the course might take us, what are some key capacities that we will develop through the course, but I've had experiences where I've sort of mapped it out, like you say, not in a linear kind of way, and presented it to students. And then I've given them the parameters of our exploration and our time together. So, these are the grading policies that will guide our practice. These are the, the calendar description that we must adhere to. But outside of that, everything is open. And so what can you bring in? And I draw a lot from indigenous pedagogies where each member of the community needs to be is recognized for gifts and needs to be responsible for bringing their gifts into sharing their gifts into the community. And so when you open that up, then there's all sorts of interference and different things that evolve. But you can be that everybody understands that there's parameters and there's some things that we must adhere to. So those have been really exciting opportunities. So I'm not sure if it's possible in your learning context. I know I've worked with other teachers who have worked in very conservative teaching contexts, and they weren't necessarily engaging in diffractive methodologies, but they were wanting to do more co-constructed emergent learning with students. And so they came together with the students and said, look, this is what the expectations are. If we work through this really fast, then we can all use this other time to do this more co-constructed, engaged work.
That's right.
And everybody, and it really, again, it was like ontological, right? Because they're all coming together in this relational way to enable something different to happen in their classroom.
Oh, Petra is saying, thank you, Dr. Hill. Petra is our PhD student.
Oh, okay.
In here.
Yeah,
Oh, okay.
Simon Fraser.
Yeah.
LCL, Languages,
Oh,
Cultures,
okay.
and Services.
Hi,
Yeah.
Petra.
Yeah.
And then one kind of question I have is that you talk about the space and time that are where we are physically interacting, and whether it's nature or classroom,
Right.
but we are living in a very much online virtual world.
Yes.
In that sense, how does this diffraction epistemology, ontological views can be implicated in, for example, virtual pedagogy or virtual online learning and so forth?
Yeah, another great question, and I don't know that I have an answer that is equivalent to the depth of the question. But I'm just thinking again to think of technologies as being, a different form of diffractive apparatus, and
Yes.
playing with them and thinking about, what does this assemblage produce,
Yeah. Yeah.
and thinking about the uniqueness of an online environment where you could have multiple linguistic, visual, emojis, like everything that multimodalities
Semiotizing.
that are co-occurring.
Yeah, yeah.
And how that, I think you have a beautiful sign in one of your publications that shows language, and it shows visuals, and it shows and then a second language or something like that. And so just thinking about how the online space really can produce these very unique assemblages that enable this translanguaging and transworlding, right?
Yeah. And now we are timing. This is morning in Asia.
Okay.
And we also trans-Pacific Ocean.
Great.
We've got participants all over listening to you, interacting with you. Yeah.
And I think it's really interesting how we, again, Barad talks about these agential cuts, right? Where things are configured in different ways temporarily to produce, this different boundaries between bodies.
Yeah.
So in this particular configuration, we are all congealing as one group of scholars, which is really exciting.
Yeah.
But then we're also, again, in our own separate assemblages, in our own relational fields.
Configurations.
Right.
Yeah, and that goes really well with translanguaging because we try to break down the solid boundaries of language A, language B, language C. But this agential cut is a really nice concept. Sometimes you need to say, okay, this is your mother tongue. I respect that as your showing your agency. This is my mother tongue. So, So I think this theory is really very useful for us. We can break through this binary, either or binary.
Yes. And think about how things are fluid and emerging, right?
Yeah,
So
and sometimes it can be with this agential cuts, you can have boundaries, but then they're never set in stone and always fluid and capable of reconfigurating.
And I was thinking about your work as well. You have one example where the teacher is seeking help from students about moving between languages, among languages. So how that not only that reconfigures two people in terms of who is the teacher and who is the student.
And how differential. Because the science teacher, the Hong Kong teacher, has never seen a camel, right? Is camel a herbivore? And then the students, of course! And then ooms is the Urdu word for camel, of course, right? So it's but then the rapport is so good, and the atmosphere is so good because the teacher is not always there, the most knowledgeable one.
And that's that ontological shift, right? Where it's the meaning making that's involving these different languages and different sounds.
Different sounds.
Right?
And the students are emotionally so excited. Ooms. And then the teacher, ooms. And then the teacher, using this Japanese manga style, sweating. I learned something.
And that really also connects very well with like critical pedagogy and critical theory, because one thing that I was grappling with is it if we incorporate some of the multiple meaning makings and multiple ways of understanding, isn't that go into anything goes? And that's not the case that you're kind of describing. There's the boundaries and there is a point of direction that people are making meanings into certain ways, collectively and collaboratively. So therefore, it's not something. It's just everything is like meaningful, but
I really like the idea of this agential cut, right?
Mm-hmm.
And for this moment, we conjure this configuration in this boundary, but we know that it's fluid. For another moment, it will be another configuration, another pattern.
And I'm noticing I think we're coming to the end of our time together pretty quickly. So maybe just to piggyback on that idea, is I just wanted to share this quote from Barad that I really appreciate, and it makes me think about why diffractive practice matters to me. Because Barad talks about each assemblage as being not only ontological and epistemological, but also ethical. And so she says, each interaction matters, since the possibility for what the world may become calls out in the pause that precedes each breath before a moment comes into being and the world is remade again. Because the becoming of the world is a deeply ethical matter.
Yes.
And so I love that idea of the pause that's calling out, and that there's this opportunity for distinct and collective bodies to interact from within to produce something different.
So if you can give us a bit of one tips, if we were to do, and many of us as are teachers / researchers, and if we were to incorporate some of the ideas into their own research, where can we start from? Like, what can we do?
There's so many different ways. So, like, something that's been very generative for me is the diffractive reading, where Barad talks about reading text through each other.
That's right. You showed that in your chapter.
Yes. So for me, when I was thrown into this situation where I had a new teaching assignment that was far exceeding, my normal teaching assignments, I could engage in this reflective practice, looking back at where I might find an entry point from my previous experience, or trying to, invoke these repertoires that I carry from past experiences. But ultimately, it didn't give me a lot to go on to move forward. And so what I like about the diffractive reading is that, unlike the reflective practice, which is retrospective, this diffractive reading and diffractive practice occurs on the very edge of the future. And so what I was able to do was to read my scholarship through my colleague, who was much more experienced in this area than I was, Laura Pearsall's scholarship. And I was able to identify where there were sort of resonances, where there was ruptures, where these differences were occurring in our work, and how those differences were being made. And that gave me a really great jumping off point to engage in a different kind of way as a practitioner. So I think diffractive reading, I think it would be really, really fun. I would have loved to have done this when I had more time, to read your scholarship through the diffractive practitioner paper and think,
read yours through.
so maybe this is something we can do, because we can see where are those resonances, because it seems like there are so many resonances, and when does your practice and my practice extend one another or create differences. I also, in the article, I mentioned the interview to the double.
That's such a good method.
Which I love, because it's really helped us to think about how we are situated in these material relational fields as practitioners. And so the idea is you account for like a typical day in your practice to someone, and then you go back and you look for the materials that impact and guide your practice in particular ways. And when I did it, I was surprised at how many how many things were really influencing
Yeah.
how I was enacting my practice.
For those who just joined in this article, Becoming Diffractive as Practitioners, in this article, Dr. Hill mentions this method, interview of the double. It's a really easy to use but very powerful methodology, especially for teachers, researchers. I highly recommend it. Read the chapter, read the article, Becoming Diffractive as Practitioners. And you know how to apply this. You can actually write an article using this method.
Yes. So it's I learned about it through a chapter by Nicolini and Rowe, and they talk about how practice is both multiple and singular. So it's multiple in the potentia that is there for enacting different things, but it's singular in your action. And I think often we get stuck in these very usual ways of and engaging our practice.
Who might not have read this part of your article, just briefly mention how to do this method, how to use this method.
Sure. So the idea is that you talk about enacting your practice in a way that you could educate a double, somebody who would stand in the place of you, and you have to give as much detail as possible so that this double could come and be you at work and not get caught. So it forces you to really think about what are the specifics of the material entanglements that enable you or that guide your practice or shape your practice in a particular way. So when I went through this exercise, I was able to identify all these different kinds of entanglements that shifted my practice in certain ways, created particular phenomena, connected or created particular relationships between myself and students, myself and my colleagues.
This is a very good methodology, actually. Very fine-grained description of your practice that you have been doing without really paying attention to it.
And I think it also has implications for applied linguists as well, where when some students were talking in their own language to the another students, or when the teacher is trying to encourage the student the whole language in classroom, then why that happens? That
exactly.
We can talk about, a teacher could talk about what were the constraints and possibilities that enabled this particular moment and so forth. So which could create potential other directions as well.
There's more than the refractive journal that teachers have been trained to use, right? Do your teaching practice, write your refractive journal, but write this interview of the double again.
It's ongoing.
Ongoing.
It's, what are you saying? Something in action.
It's diffraction in action?
Yeah, diffraction in action.
I know that. Like a tongue twister. That's diffraction in action. So, any questions? Phoebe, you said good to break rigid boundaries and welcome reconfiguration through emergent fluidity. Great insight. Diffraction welcomes pluralities and diversifying, changes in meaning making and co-flowing.
Oh, thank you, Phoebe, for such a detailed and insightful comment.
So any other questions?
So one thing I remember I thought was quite interesting is that from Tsinghua, is there do you think if there is a need to reflect diffractively on teaching practices that we currently believe to be working fine?
I thought that was such a great question, because there's that saying, if it's not broke, don't fix it, right? And so it made me think, because diffractive practice is based on this relational ontology, if you continue to work in the same ways all the time, it's sort of limiting the potentiality of what could occur, and you don't know what's going to happen. That's the big thing about diffractive practice. You have to be able to give up that sense of control, and you have to be able, you have to be able to be comfortable with not knowing where this is going to take you or what's going to evolve. And so I like this notion of pedagogical camping that I've been thinking about, and it's based on the work of Barad. She talks about intellectual camping, you know, where you can have a intellectual commitment that's fluid and not static, that's changing. But she talks about that as being not something that's constantly changing, but that you would go through, rhizomatic patterns, and then you would come back to more familiar patterns of movement. And so I think I love this idea of pedagogical camping, where you can do your thing, your usual thing, the usual way, and then push yourself to invite interference and see what happens and what is coming into being.
Idea of adventure and journey.
Yes.
Rather than building a stone house and locking ourselves
Yeah,
into the stone
yeah.
house and then don't leave the house. The camping metaphor is a nice, we journey. Oh, and then you have Brent, our another Brent Amberdy. Hi, interesting discussion.
Hello.
Thank you.
Oh, thank you so much. Thank you for spending your Friday night or Saturday morning with us here.
Yeah, it's fun. We are camping here. United. Just for this hour.
So, if there is no more question, then maybe we will end our
And
discussion.
before we end, we will do our announcement of our next live event.
Yes.
And
With Dr. Paul Thibault and Steve Thorne on April 3rd in Vancouver time 6 p.m., April 4th in Hong Kong and 10 a.m. And the title of the talk is Languaging is Process and Movement.
Languaging is process and movement. Okay? So
Sounds amazing.
April the 3rd for Friday, 6 p.m. here, Saturday, 10 a.m.
Yeah.
And I see you then, okay?
Oh, and I would just like to say thank you very much
Thank you
to
so
Dr.
much.
Lin
Thank you so much
and
for
your colleagues that are here at SFU and in Hong Kong and in other
And
places
all over
who are
the world.
tuning in. And just really wanting to acknowledge that, of course, this is work is a collective production, and wanting to acknowledge my colleagues in the G7 research group,
The group of 7.
the group of 7, practitioner inquiry and post-human research group, the Reading, Thinking, and Doing Club here at SFU. And so we have a lot of really exciting work that's coming out, I think, of our faculty in relation to education and new materiality, and also to thank my place-conscious colleagues and all the teachers that I've worked with that helped to shape my thinking and my practice. And my kids. Thank you.
And we want to thank Tsinghua, Phoebe, and all our YouTube research channel volunteers. Okay, who have helped us to make this possible.
Thank you very much.
Thank
all.
you.
Yeah.
Thank you. Enjoy your weekend.
Okay, bye.
See you in April.